Welcome to the Leadership with Vision podcast by Austin Gardner. For more information and resources, visit worldevangelism.net.
Well, here I am in Ephrata, Lima, Peru again with missionary Joe Kotvas. And we have talked to you last week about the ministry here and how God has used Brother Joe. And this week we're going to talk about deaf ministry in the United States. We may get to other subjects, but, I'm going to let him kind of chew me out and tell me what to do and how to do it. And if you know people in the States, I don't think about deaf people, Brother Joe. I just don't think about it.
Out of sight, out of mind.
I don't mean to be rude. I just don't think.
This is what it is, out of sight, out of mind. Because there's nothing distinguishable about them. There's no neon sign saying, hey, I'm deaf, I need Jesus. Unless you see someone signing in the corner, you may misunderstand what they're doing. You might think it's just somebody having a spirited argument if you don't know sign language. So therefore, they're not something that's before you every day. When you think of lost souls, you're thinking in a generic sense. So in your mind, you're including blind, deaf, halt, all that kind of thing in your mind, but you're not actually out purposely going on purpose to reach the deaf. And that's what I want to help people understand. A deaf person will not get saved if somebody does not go to them on purpose and reach them with the gospel.
I don't think there are any deaf that live where I am.
I think you'd be wrong. I think there are.
Well, I think you better convince me.
There are deaf in every community. They're all over.
I don't see them. I don't hear about them. And I'm going to assume that most people kind of think like I do. So could you educate us? Could you tell us where they are, how to find them, what we ought to do? So here I am. We support you. I would consider us friends. And so I'm not doing something I could be doing and should be doing and ought to be doing at Vision Baptist Church. And so you would tell me what?
Well, the first thing I would tell you is, number one, you need to pray that God opens your eyes to the need. The deaf people in the deaf communities, they're all over the place. And usually to reach a deaf person, you make friends with a deaf person, get to know them, try to get into their subculture and community, because the deaf community is a subculture in any country. In fact, deaf people from America might have more in common with deaf people from Peru than they have with their own American citizens, because the subculture is a very tight-knit group. And deaf people are all around. And they're not just coming, hey, I'm deaf. I mean, they're walking, you pass them in the streets, you see them in the supermarket, you have no clue that they're deaf, but they're there. And so the thing is, what I try to help people understand is this. You may not run across them, and you would personally admit to me that you're not a gozy outer person. You don't go out and you're not in the malls all day long. You're not doing these kind of things. Well, you're going to find people out in social venues. Deaf people like to bowl. You'll find them in bowling alleys. There are leagues for deaf people in bowling alleys. Deaf people like to congregate in malls and have fellowship, and there are places that they go. And if you want to reach the deaf, you need to find out where those places are in your community. Some communities, some states, for example, Florida, I don't know if they still do. I've been 18 years outside of the United States. So Florida has had, when I was there, a phone book just for deaf people, a statewide phone book where you could look in that phone book and you find deaf people in every community.
Nowadays, nobody has phone books.
Well, I mean,
so maybe it's
they
on
might
the
be
internet?
online, might be on the internet. So I would go internet and look for the deaf. Just type in deaf community, in your case, Alpharetta, Georgia. You might find community service agencies for the deaf, state agencies that work with the deaf, interpreting agencies, training programs in your local colleges that train interpreters for the deaf. You have to go on purpose and look for them. There are churches in your community. You just look up the churches and they'll have deaf ministries and services interpreted for the deaf. So they're out there. You just have to go look for them on purpose.
Okay, well, if they came to our church, I thought that we have some people that know a little bit about signs, but I would say, like a lot of other people, maybe we're not ready.
And that may be very well true, but don't let that stop you from getting ready for it.
Tell us how to get ready.
I would take a person, someone who has an interest and a love for it. I would put it out to you. We would like to start a deaf ministry, or at least be able to service the deaf who would come here and visiting and maybe win them for Christ and have them become active members of our church. How do we do that?
At our church, I love getting all kinds of people, but I haven't seen deaf people, so help.
What you do is you go out there and you say, okay, folks, we're going to start a deaf ministry. We don't know that there's a lot of deaf around here in our community, but we're going to at least be prepared if we find them. Understand this. How many deaf people do you have to call yourself having a deaf ministry? What does it take, 10, 20?
I think you'd have to tell me. I don't know.
The average deaf ministry size is not more than 5, 6, 7 in the average church. Remember we talked last week about how 40 deaf is a large ministry?
Yep.
The largest deaf ministry in America at one time in the Independent Baptist Circus was First Baptist Church Hammond. They were running 300. Well, why they were running 300 was because they ran 6 or 7 or 8 vans out into Chicago and brought them into the church. Now, that ministry today is a shell of what it used to be. They don't even have a full-time deaf pastor like they used to. And so they only have a handful of deaf that are even coming anymore. But they're good people, and they're still ministering to the deaf, even on a limited scale than what they compared to what they were doing before. Trinity Baptist Church, for example, still has a large active deaf ministry. And I would say they're still running about 40, 50 deaf. And they have a full-time pastor who is deaf. Their pastor to the deaf, John Olson, is a deaf pastor. He was my roommate and when I was in the Navy and when he was in Bible college there at Trinity. And
he was in the Navy as a deaf person?
No, he was in the Navy. He was in Bible college. But we were roommates. That's how I learned sign language so quick, because when I get involved in ministry, I just jump in. So I had 2 or 3 roommates that were deaf in my home. I brought them in, and we had them as roommates, and I learned sign language, and I learned the culture and the community of the deaf through that. And he was actually the best man at my wedding. He was my best man at my wedding, John Olson was. And we stayed very close friends even to this day. And he's still ministering there at Trinity Baptist Church as their deaf pastor. But for Alpharetta, Georgia, you're going to have to, one of the things is you catch a vision by what you see. You have no vision for the deaf because you don't see them. So you have to go out and put deaf-centered eyes out and look. And if you find them, you say, okay, who in this church is willing to sacrifice and take the time? The church will pay for the courses for you to go out there and learn sign language. We'll pay for you to do it.
And where would they go to learn sign language?
They can go to local community colleges. Most community colleges have an interpreter program or a sign language program. If you don't know where, you can look it up online, look it up at the universities in Atlanta. There's tons of that stuff. There's all kinds of resources.
How long do they need to learn signs?
It depends on the person. Like any language, it depends on the person. Some people, I know a guy who started learning sign language about the same time I did. The guy still can't sign his way out of a paper bag. And it isn't because he doesn't have a heart for the deaf. He is just not wired for a gestural language. And so some people learn sign language very quickly. I learned it very quickly. Why? Because I totally immersed myself in the community.
What is really quickly?
Less than a year. If you immerse yourself into the deaf world, you can be doing interpreting work, not professional, not super good, but you can do some preliminaries like the song services and announcements, and learn to get accustomed to signing and interpreting in front of people. And so it takes at least a year to really get the basics down to be able to effectively communicate and understand the deaf, because it's not all about you knowing the language put out. You've got to be able to read the language as well. And so that takes a lot more training. That takes a lot more time. It takes several years for a person to get fluent and competent in any type of sign. And then it's one of those things, like any language, you keep learning as you go. Never stop learning sign.
So what are some problems would foresee for our church if I started this?
I don't know that the only problem is availability is manpower, number one. Number two, the dedication of the people to do it. And number three, getting out there and finding the deaf. That's your most difficult, because what you have told me, now I don't know if you could talk to all of your staff and say, do we see deaf people? Not does Austin Gardner see deaf people. Do you see deaf people? When you're out there in communities, do you see deaf? And if they say, no, we don't see deaf people, it may be you have a smaller population in your area because of the nature of your area. Most deaf people, once they're out of their home and they live on their own, most of them aren't going to be living where the engineers live or where the doctors live or where the people who are highly educated and have large incomes live. Alpharetta is one of those areas. So therefore, you're going to have a less population of deaf in Alpharetta. But if you go down to downtown Atlanta, you go down into the areas that are maybe middle class or below, you're going to find a lot of deaf people. You're going to find a great deal of deaf people there. There's a deaf church in Atlanta, Georgia. Actually, it's more near Smyrna. Bruce Kelly is a deaf pastor.
Smyrna, Georgia?
Yeah, Smyrna. In that area of town. He's not quite in Smyrna anymore, but that's where he started out, in Independent Baptist Church, Smyrna. And now he has his own deaf church there. And so he's in Atlanta, Georgia area, and he runs, 30, maybe 40. I'm not exactly sure how many he's in right now. The last time I was there was like 25. So, and that's with a deaf pastor as a doctor's earned doctor degree and a deaf pastor, and his wife's deaf. And so they're out there. You just have to decide what is the need. In my book, I write about the different types of deaf ministries and the different levels of deaf ministries that a church could have. And yours would be where you would start out, you got 1 or 2 deaf coming, so you just have basically an interpreted ministry where someone comes and interprets the messages of the Sunday school lesson. And then as it grows, or even if with the 1 or 2 deaf, if you're able to dedicate a man to teach that class to the deaf, then that man can teach the deaf. And that's one thing I want to emphasize as well. It's wonderful, all the dear ladies that have given their life to interpret and work with the deaf. But there's a mindset, a natural mindset, that deaf ministry is just ladies' work, because it's like working with the children. Deaf ministry is not just ladies' work. How shall they hear without a preacher? Deaf people need a preacher. Need a man of God who's going to learn their language well enough to convey the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ and to train them in ministry, and it has to be a man. Women ain't going to be preaching to them. We're not Pentecostals. We believe that men are preachers. So where are the men that are going to step up and say, and not only that, men, in my opinion, I have a different philosophy from others in the United States. I believe the best interpreter is the best interpreter, whether he's a male or female. There is one philosophy out there that comes from a famous deaf ministry that they only want female interpreters because the female interpreter doesn't take the authority away from the male, from the preacher. Well, that implies that deaf people are too ignorant to figure out who the preacher is while they're standing there looking at him. An interpreter is an accommodation. It's a person that just transmits a message in a different language. Just like if you're preaching in Spanish, and if there was only a lady interpreter available to interpret for you, okay, she's not stealing your authority. She's conveying you. She's a conduit. Mm-hmm. Well, that's what it is with sign language. But most male interpreters are a little more willing to be more aggressive in their signing than the average, note I say, the average female interpreter. I know some very good female interpreters that are very aggressive in their signing, and when the preacher's hot and spitting and stomping and snorting, snorting, they're hot and spitting, stomping and snoring, and they do a great job. Some of them much more skilled than I am. But that's not the norm. That's people who have been well trained and have a real heart for doing their interpreting job. Most women are they're like, oh, I can't. He's stomping. I can't stomp. I've got to be soft. Well, you do a disservice to the deaf person. It's just like you've gone to places where you had interpreters, correct? And you can tell the difference when an interpreter is as passionate about what you're saying as you are, or when they're just blah, blah, blah. That's horrible. And so an interpreter needs to convey not only the words, but needs to convey the sense, the feeling, the essence, and the tone that the preachers interpret. And in sign language, at least in a hearing world, if the preacher is stomping and snoring with strong tone, strong energy, and the interpreter is a timid person, at least they get to see the passion and feel the passion in the voice that comes from the expositor. But in the deaf world, they only get to see. They don't get to hear. They don't get to hear the inflections in the tone. Well, you can make those inflections in sign language. You can make that deaf person feel the message just like a hearing interpreter. But they've got to be a quality, good interpreter. It takes years of practice to do that. So it goes back to this. You need a man who can lead that ministry, who can teach Sunday school, and eventually have separate services for the deaf in your church, where they have at least once or twice a week have a separate in their language service. I disagree with the mindset that we have to take Spanish people and stick them in the English church and just have interpreters. I believe Spanish people are going to learn the most when they are preached to in their native tongue. And so I love churches that have Spanish ministries, that have Spanish pastors, that preach them in Spanish, but they mix every once in a while to maintain the harmony and the unity of the local church. And that's all fine. The deaf are the same way. I'm not against completely, well, I am a little more against deaf church philosophy today than I was when I first started, because there's very few deaf churches led by deaf pastors that are completely self-autonomous local independent Baptist churches that do not depend on some kind of funding, missionary or otherwise, to maintain. There is one, and it was that I know of, that's doing a great job in Ohio, but that's the exception. It's not the norm for deaf churches. So I'm a firm believer in large, semi-autonomous deaf ministries under the umbrella of a good hearing church, but it only will succeed if the pastor believes in it, learns. He doesn't have to learn the entire language, but learns enough that, for example, when I was in Belleville, Illinois, I started a deaf ministry in a church there. The pastor couldn't learn signs. It just wasn't for him. But when he'd go shake the hands of the deaf, and he learned just a couple signs. Me, dumb as a box of rocks. He said, I'm dumb as a box of rocks. And he'd sign dumb, and the deaf would love him because he took the time to come down, shake their hand, look them in the eye, tell them he loved them, tell them he cared about them, and even though he didn't know the language well. But you know why Trinity Baptist Church's deaf ministry was so successful? Because the pastor, Dr. Bob Gray, in those days, he's the one that started that deaf ministry there. He learned sign language, and he, from time to time, would look over the deaf and sign to them from the platform, telling them he cared about it. What do you think about that? And he would have deaf men come up and pray in the auditorium service. He would have deaf men come and preach to the hearing, and the deaf loved him. They loved him. There wasn't a deaf person I know that didn't love Dr. Bob Gray, because he made them feel like they were on equal footing and par with whatever hearing person. So if the pastor's behind it, the pastor's not behind it, he says, well, we got to have this just so I can put it on our website. We have a deaf ministry, so everyone can think we're doing something around here. That ain't going to work. The pastor has to be behind it. He has to be passionate about it. He does not have to be the main person leading in respect of day-to-day operating with the deaf, but he needs to make sure there's somebody that is doing that, and he needs to stay actively involved, at least in a loving, caring attitude that he's with them. He'll go to their activities every once in a while. He doesn't know the language. That's okay, but he learns a little bit here and there, and he tries. All the deaf want to see is, do you really love me? Does Jesus you talk about, does he love me as much as you do? And if he does, I want that. And so that's what's so important. In Alpharetta, Georgia, Austin Garden has to get the vision. He has to decide, I'm going to go out there on purpose and look for the deaf and try to reach them. And he has to encourage his people and find leadership in his church. The one man that I know of is a molder of leaders. I've never seen anyone better as Austin Gardner. He can help motivate somebody in his church to say, that's going to be my ministry.
That's manipulation.
That is.
I have just been manipulated by the best. Okay, so what is the mental ability and capacity of deaf people? To what level can they attain?
A deaf person can level anything they wish. The sky's the limit. They can be just like, look, there are deaf lawyers, there are deaf doctors, there are even deaf policemen. Now, I don't advocate that, but in Gallaudet, they have deaf police, Gallaudet University College for the Deaf. They have every engineers, deaf technicians. They are so good. What the neat thing about deaf people is when they obtain a skill, they are some of the best workers you could have because they don't sit around the water cooler chatting. They do their job. They focus on their work. They're not distracted by music. They're not distracted by noise. They just do their work. And there are very high functioning deaf people that come out of places like National Technical Institute for the Deaf, NTID at RIT in Rochester, New York, at Gallaudet University in Maryland, near Washington, D.C. The United States, one thing about the United States is the United States has the best opportunity for deaf people all over the world to get a first-class education. So the United States has some very seriously high-functioning deaf. They have the normal deaf people. For years, deaf in America, there was a state school for the deaf, or deaf and blind, as in the case in Florida. They had in St. Augustine, they had the Florida School for the Deaf and Blind. And for years, those schools were residential. Now they're getting away from that, and they're mainstreaming deaf people into the local communities and local schools, which have special programs for them. It depends on the educational plan for a specific deaf child as to which plan they go, and the ability of the parents to deal with it. So you will have deaf people of all cultures. The average deaf person's education level is probably about maybe 5th, 6th grade level, 7th grade level, the average deaf person. But there is a good number of deaf people that are way above that university levels. For example, John Olson. John Olson was an NTID graduate. He had an associate's degree from NTID.
What is that?
National Institute of Technical the Deaf, Rochester Institute of Technical. So then he went to Bible college, graduated, and good grade. The guy's as sharp as a tack. And John Olson is profoundly deaf. But his parents worked on him from the time he was a baby to 14 years old. They wouldn't let him learn sign language. But his parents were intimately involved with his life and with oralization. So John Olson does a pretty good job reading this. He learned sign language at 14 and opened his world. He says it just completely opened up my horizons. So if a deaf person has parents that are 100% behind them, the mom and the dad, or at least the mom learns the sign language norm, and they really treat that child as if it was just like any other child they have, that deaf child is going to go places. There are deaf people who have lost their hearing. They were 3, 4, 5, 6 years old because of a fever, because of meningitis, German measles, whatever the case may be. They lost their hearing. They already had a basis in language, so their mind works on a hearing level, not on a deaf level. Therefore, those people also do well. They excel. They do well because they already have a basis in the oral language. The people who have the most difficult time are the people that come from homes where they were born deaf, and there's a poverty level there, so that there was not much investment in the deaf child. They were shoved off to a school that didn't appropriately help them, and so their level of education is lower. So they understand a lot of basic stuff, but you're not going to get them. They're never going to be able to be the higher function. You have that in the hearing world, but because of the volume of people, you don't see it as much. In the deaf world, it's a much smaller community, 5 to 7%, and that 5 to 7% include all versions of deafness, whether it be latent deafness, whether it be deafness at birth, whether it be people who are older who lost their hearing. So that profoundly deaf from the time they're very young or at birth is like just about 1%, 0.8%, something like that. And so, but there again, they need the gospel as well. And so we need to go to them on purpose, find them. And that's another way you find the deaf. Georgia has a state school for the deaf. I don't know if it's still functioning, but they did. The local school board, the local communities have schools that have special programs for the deaf. The students from your own church, some of those children go to high schools that have mainstreaming, and they'll have deaf in the school itself. That's how you can reach them. Reach them through personal friendships and contacts. Bring them in. They will help you find other deaf. Best way to find other deaf is through other deaf.
Okay. Well, I hope you've noticed that Joe is a little bit excited about deaf people and reaching them. And you can reach Joe by emailing him at jkotvas@ephata.org, correct? And what is your website again?
ephata.org and kotvas.com.
Okay. And we will have those links. Nate, I'd like you to put those links on there. I did text the guys while you were talking to find out how many of them knew deaf people, and only Robert answered. And he said, I might have passed 1 or 2 signs that say deaf child in the area when I was delivering pizza. Not very common, but he said he has seen a couple of signs.
And some of those signs have been there for years. That's one of the ways to find deaf people. Travel, you see that, and then if you're out knocking on doors, say, by the way, do you know anybody who's deaf community?
All right. Well, I will see if we can't do more about doing something for deaf and vision, and maybe if you're a pastor, you could consider that also. I just want to see as many people get saved as I possibly can, and I know you do too. Thank you for listening to Leadership with Vision. God bless you.
You've been listening to Leadership with Vision by Austin Gardner. Visit worldevangelism.net to discover more podcasts and useful articles.